Meanwhile, Chanty and Vasper arrived at a cave, the interior polished to a smooth finish, its walls glistening as though deliberately crafted. It was unmistakably a vast cavern. The cave's entrance was concealed by a cascading waterfall, and a small stream from the falls flowed gently into the cave, forming a narrow river that wound its way through the cavern and exited through another opening. Chanty stood in awe, her eyes wandering over the breathtaking surroundings. The ceiling gleamed, polished like the walls, creating a surreal beauty that seemed almost intentional. A massive bed, larger than a king size, dominated one part of the cavern. Nearby, a small kitchen could be seen, and a door hinted at the presence of a bathroom. The clarity of the water flowing beside them, sourced from the waterfall at the cave's entrance, was mesmerizing. Vasper silently observed Chanty, who was captivated by the cave's beauty, her eyes darting across its details. Yet, her gaze was still tearful, the remnants of her earlier crying evident. Seeing this, Vasper was overcome with guilt and pity for Chanty, knowing that her tears were caused by what Zalora had done. Chanty avoided his touch, so he simply watched her, his heart heavy with remorse. Chanty refused to meet his eyes, and Vasper noticed that his t-shirt was soaked with sweat. He removed it, exposing his well-defined muscles, and as Chanty's eyes briefly met his, she quickly turned away in embarrassment, her gaze fixing on the cave wall. Vasper walked to the wall, retrieving something to wear. Curious, Chanty watched as Vasper approached the wall and touched it, pushing against it. To her astonishment, the wall opened, revealing a walk-in closet illuminated with a soft, inviting glow. Intrigued, Chanty couldn't help but stare. Vasper turned to her, understanding the curiosity in her expression, and extended his hand as if inviting her to come closer and see for herself. Slowly, Chanty approached but refrained from taking his hand, merely peering inside the luxurious closet. The interior was stunning, every detail a testament to Vasper's immense wealth. "Of course, you're a billionaire. Why am I even surprised?" Chanty muttered softly, but Vasper heard her words clearly. Suddenly, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her close, her body colliding with his bare chest. Chanty gasped, her eyes landing on his chiseled torso and broad shoulders. Vasper held her firmly, his gaze intense as he whispered, "I love you," his deep voice laden with longing. Chanty, however, wasn't ready to utter those words back. It was as though a thorn lodged in her throat, preventing her from speaking. She didn't know why. It wasn't because she doubted her love for Vasper, she knew she loved him. But the weight of saying those words felt insurmountable, her tongue heavy with hesitation. Vasper waited, hope gleaming in his eyes, eager to hear those words from her lips. But Chanty pushed him away, her gaze shifting to another direction. "Get dressed, Vasper, and take me back to the tent. They're probably looking for me, David's worried." "I just want to rest," she said softly, walking towards the flowing water at the cave's entrance. The sound of the water cascading down the entrance seemed to soothe Chanty's senses, grounding her amidst the turmoil in her heart. Vasper, disheartened by her cold response, stood still, the sting of her rejection piercing him deeply. He understood her hesitation, but the pain of it was no less sharp. "You can rest here. I'll take you back 2 hours before twilight," Vasper said quietly as he grabbed a t-shirt and changed into it. Chanty watched him, noting the way he moved with an air of power, his presence exuding a force she couldn't explain, a force that sent her heart racing uncontrollably. The physical attraction she felt for Vasper seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. His long hair, tied in a half-man bun, only added to his irresistible allure. He looked impossibly handsome, a truth that had made countless women weep over him. Chanty wasn't immune to this effect, no matter how hard she tried to compose herself. As Vasper walked toward her, the pounding of her heart intensified. The rugged charm of his plain white t-shirt and tight, tattered pants only amplified his magnetism. His perfect physique, towering height of over 6 feet, and commanding presence made it impossible for Chanty to keep her emotions in check. Her gaze drifted to the dried bloodstains on his pants, a reminder of the wound that had healed thanks to his self-healing abilities. Vasper's piercing gaze locked onto hers, a look that had always melted her heart in the past, and still did. Yet, having been with Jake, she had taught herself to resist Vasper's allure, a defense she had maintained. Now that they were back together, her heart seemed to betray her resolve, allowing the fluttering excitement to return each time Vasper looked at her. Chanty turned her head away, her eyes falling on the water streaming through the cave's entrance, its movement like a delicate curtain over the cavern. The light in the cave came from crystals embedded in the walls, glowing softly like fluorescent lights, though there were no visible wires or electricity. Chanty wondered if they were in the inner world or the outer world, a mystery she couldn't unravel. And when Vasper was finally beside Chanty, his arms immediately wrapped tightly around her body. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling its scent before placing a tender kiss on it. "I love you so much, my queen," he murmured, his deep voice like a melody that caressed Chanty's ears. The warmth of his body radiated through her back as she felt his strong embrace. Vasper swept her hair aside, pressing soft, lingering kisses on her neck, kissing her neck repeatedly. His lips were warm, electrifying her senses with each touch, sending shivers that coursed through her entire being. His kisses traced the length of her neck, traveling from her nape to the other side of her neck, igniting every nerve as his lips whispered against her skin. "I love you. Please, I need to hear that you love me too, Chanty," he said, his voice soft. Vasper pleaded, almost begging. Chanty closed her eyes tightly, a tear escaping down her cheek. She didn't know why, but an overwhelming wave of emotion had suddenly overcome her. Vasper continued his gentle kisses, his arms holding her even tighter, his embrace tightening as if he never wanted to let her go. "I just want you to rest properly here before I take you back to the tent," he said, his voice husky yet tender, his lips brushing against her ear. "But I can't stop myself anymore. Seeing you like this, so beautiful and radiant. You pull me like a magnet every time our eyes meet. I can't get enough of you." His words, spoken against her ear, sent her heart racing. Even as she tried to suppress the joy blooming in her chest, she refused to let it show. She didn't want Vasper to feel triumphant. She couldn't let him see the effect he had on her. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction, though she couldn't explain why she felt this way. "Please," Vasper pleaded again, his voice more desperate now. "Say the words I want to hear from you. I need to hear them." He gently turned her around so that she faced him, but Chanty kept her head bowed, unable to meet his gaze. Vasper tilted her chin upwards, forcing their eyes to meet. His expression changed instantly when he saw her tear-streaked face. His brows furrowed in concern, and his eyes reflected deep sorrow. "I'm so sorry. I won't push you anymore. Please, forgive me," Vasper said, his voice trembling as he brushed her tears away with his fingers, his hand softly stroking her face and hair. "I just want to see you smile and laugh again like before. Don't worry about what's happening now, everything will go back to normal." His tone was gentle and reassuring, but Chanty's voice broke as she finally spoke. "I want to go back to the outer world. I want to see my home again, the vineyard," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Vasper nodded, understanding her longing. He pulled her into another embrace. "I understand how you feel. I feel the same way. I want to go back too, I don't want to stay here either," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. The kiss lingered, deep and filled with emotion, as if he wanted to pour all his feelings into it. When their lips parted, Vasper lifted Chanty effortlessly into his arms and carried her to the large bed. He gently laid her down, the softness of the mattress cradling her as he lay beside her. "I want you to rest now. Don't think about anything else. In just a few hours, you'll face your enemy, Alexander. For now, let yourself relax," Vasper said, pulling the blanket over them both. He drew her closer, resting her head on his arm and wrapping her in his protective embrace. "Trust me, you'll defeat him. After that, we'll figure out how to request some time off so we can return to the outer world," he added, his voice filled with certainty. Chanty said nothing, but her mind raced. Sleep was elusive as countless thoughts swirled through her head, one of them being Jake. "They're probably looking for me right now, Vasper," she finally said, her voice quiet but worried. Vasper turned to her, his gaze serious. "I know, but don't worry. They can't do anything but wait for us. That's why you need to rest now. When you wake up, we'll eat before heading back to the tent," he reassured her. After a moment of silence, Chanty's curiosity got the better of her. Where are we, Vasper? What is this place? She asked. Vasper smiled slightly, sensing her wonder. This is my sanctuary, he explained. I designed it myself on my 150th birthday. It's part of the inner world, hidden in the heart of a virgin forest. The entrance is only through the waterfall, and everything here was brought in from the outer world through teleportation. It's my retreat, a place where I can rest undisturbed. Chanty fell silent, absorbing his words. Minutes passed before she finally spoke again. Even Zalora? You didn't bring her here? Chanty asked, her gaze steady on Vasper. Her tone probing but cautious. Vasper's gaze locked with hers, serious and unwavering. His expression was stoic, devoid of any hint of deceit. No, he answered firmly. I didn't bring her here. I don't believe you, Chanty shot back, suspicion lacing her voice. A mischievous smile tugged at Vasper's lips. I swear. Whether you believe me or not, it's true, I didn't bring her here. Please, stop thinking about Zalora. Chanty fell silent, her doubts lingering. Vasper, however, pulled her into a tight embrace. Minutes passed in quiet stillness, but Chanty remained restless, her thoughts preventing sleep. Vasper noticed her unease as he studied her intently, waiting for signs that she had drifted off. Slowly, his hand began to wander, its warmth trailing down her body toward her thigh. With a quick, irritated movement, Chanty caught his hand, pushing it back to her waist. Stop, she said sharply, her voice edged with annoyance. Vasper chuckled softly, amused by her reaction. I'm just trying to help you relax, this will help you fall asleep, he whispered against her lips, his tone gentle and laced with teasing. The proximity sent Chanty's heart racing, and his arms tightened around her as he captured her lips in a slow, passionate kiss. His touch was filled with love and playful torment, his movements deliberate and unhurried, teasing her with a slow, torturous rhythm. Chanty froze for a moment, unable to react, allowing Vasper's movements. Caught off guard by the intensity of his kiss. She didn't respond, letting him take the lead as his hands ventured again toward her thighs. But this time, she snapped out of it, swatting his hand away and shoving his chest away with force to push him back. Vasper looked at her, his eyes questioning yet tender. He leaned over her, propping himself up on one elbow while his other hand gently caressed her hair and cheek. What's wrong? He asked softly, his voice soothing, yet it made Chanty's heart feel heavy with unspoken emotions, his voice melting her heart. But Chanty fought to suppress her emotions. Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. In the end, Chanty broke the gaze, turning her head away. I'm not in the mood, Vasper. I'll take a warm bath instead. That'll help me relax, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Vasper's smile was understanding, though the subtle sting of rejection flickered in his pride. All right, he said after a moment. I'll get you some fresh clothes while you bathe. The bathroom's through that door, he added, pointing to a door on the right side of the cavern. Chanty followed his gesture with her eyes before nodding. She began to sit up, but before she could leave, Vasper stopped her, pulling her back down to capture her lips again. This time, his kiss was hungry, brimming with desire and longing. Chanty, however, remained unresponsive, she refused to give in to his affection. When their lips parted, Vasper's intense gaze held hers. I love you so much, he murmured. Can I call you babe? You're my queen, and my baby too. Chanty bristled at the word baby, her irritation clear. I'm not a baby, she snapped, her tone sharp. Vasper's amused laugh only fueled her frustration. Okay, he said, still chuckling at her reaction. Chanty, her patience thinning, shoved him aside and quickly got up, determined to put distance between them before he could stop her again. Vasper watched her with a playful glint in his eyes as she marched toward the bathroom. All right, I'll grab your clothes, babe, he called out teasingly. Chanty didn't bother to look back, slamming the door shut behind her. Vasper's laughter echoed in the cavern. He enjoyed seeing her flustered reactions, though deep down, he longed to call her love. But that word had been claimed by Jake, and hearing it directed at Chanty from anyone else stoked an unrelenting jealousy within him. His amusement faded as his gaze shifted to the clock on the cave wall. Less than 9 hours remained until the Twilight Reckoning, the critical event in the inner world when Alexander Mondragon's power would temporarily weaken, giving challengers a rare chance to defeat him. Chanty's battle was approaching fast, and Vasper was confident she could triumph. The prophecy of the Sword of Destiny had shown him as much. But it also showed Jake's fate. Vasper had seen Jake's death at Alexander Mondragon's hands, and the thought brought a faint smile to his lips. The sound of running water from the bathroom brought Vasper back to the present. Smiling to himself, he teleported away to fetch Chanty's clothes, leaving the cavern momentarily empty except for the sound of the shower. Minutes later, Chanty emerged from the shower, her damp hair cascading over her shoulders. She walked toward a bathrobe hanging by the large mirror. The sheer size of the bathroom took her breath away. It was a perfect blend of modern luxury and natural beauty. The walls were smooth stone, left untouched to preserve the cave's essence, while the sleek mirror spanned an entire side of the room. The rain shower had adjustable warm and cold options, and even the stone floor felt refined. Chanty couldn't help but marvel at Vasper's creativity. The bathroom was a masterpiece, combining functionality with a sense of wonder. Slipping on the bathrobe, she prepared to step out, only to feel a chill of unease when she heard faint noises outside. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open and stepped into the main chamber. Vasper was there, standing by the kitchenette, unloading supplies into the refrigerator. A large suitcase sat open by the bed, its contents neatly organized, presumably her belongings. On the counter were bottles of water, wine, juices, milk, and an array of fresh fruits and other foods. Chanty watched him silently, her gaze puzzled as she tried to make sense of his calm demeanor. Vasper, sensing her eyes on him, turned to face her, a warm smile spreading across his lips. "Your things are in the suitcase. Hopefully, everything is there. Those are the items from our house near Antarctica, right?" Vasper said, looking at Chanty as he spoke. Chanty froze, her mind drifting to the memory of Vasper's house where he had proposed to her. She quickly masked her emotions, not wanting him to notice how much the memory affected her. She approached the suitcase and started sorting through it, searching for something to wear. Grateful to find a jogger and jacket, she picked them out and stood up only to realize Vasper was already standing next to her. Startled, she bumped into his body and almost lost her balance. Her heart leapt in shock, but Vasper caught her by the waist before she could fall. They stared into each other's eyes, the air thick with tension. Chanty clutched her clothes against her chest, her breathing unsteady. Electricity coursed through them as they stood frozen, locked in a gaze so deep it felt as though time had stopped. Then, without a word, their lips met in a kiss that was at once passionate and desperate. Vasper's arms wrapped tightly around her, pulling her close, his hands firm yet tender. The bathrobe Chanty had been wearing slipped from her shoulders and fell to the floor, revealing her perfect figure to Vasper's reverent gaze. His hands roamed gently over her body, his touch filled with a mix of tenderness, love, and longing. Chanty's breath hitched as her defenses crumbled. She let her arms snake around his neck, holding on to him as though anchoring herself. Clothes fell away, their barriers stripped in moments as their lips remained locked, their breathing ragged. Effortlessly, Vasper lifted her into his arms and laid her on the bed, his body pressing softly against hers. The sound of the waterfall outside the cave mingled with their muffled breaths and the rhythm of their beating hearts. Vasper's declaration of love seemed endless, punctuated every time their lips met in a fiery collision of longing and devotion. The room filled with the sound of their ragged breaths, each inhale and exhale heavy with desire, their mingled gasps a testament to the ecstasy they had just reached together. His kisses lingered, tender and unhurried, a soothing balm to the storm of their shared passion. "I love you so much," Vasper murmured against her lips, his voice hoarse, still tinged with the deep breaths of pleasure and the fatigue of restraint. He fought valiantly to hold himself back, determined not to cross the boundary that would take Chanty's virginity. The struggle was excruciating, his need for her almost unbearable, yet the satisfaction of pleasing her, of seeing her unravel beneath him, was more rewarding than anything he had ever known. His lips traveled with unrelenting devotion, planting soft, lingering kisses along Chanty's neck, her cheeks, her lips, and her breasts. "How I wish I could leave kiss marks on you," he whispered with a frustrated chuckle, "but not yet." Chanty said nothing, surrendering to the tenderness of his touch. Her breaths came fast and shallow, her arms stretched above her head, leaving herself exposed and vulnerable to his kisses. When his lips teased the sensitive crook of her elbow, she let out a burst of laughter, the ticklish sensation making her squeal. Her laughter was infectious, and Vasper joined in, his deep, velvety chuckle filling the space between them. "I love you so much, babe." "My queen," Vasper said with a voice full of reverence, the words flowing effortlessly from his lips. Chanty's heart skipped a beat, her chest tightening as the weight of his words settled over her. The sound of him calling her babe felt foreign but thrilling, sending a strange flutter through her. She bit her lip, unsure how to respond, her cheeks heating as the corners of her mouth threatened to curl into a shy smile. Vasper caught her reaction, his lips curving into a playful grin. "From now on, you'll call me babe too, all right?" he teased, his voice laced with amusement. Chanty rolled her eyes, her lips twitching with defiance. "I won't," she said, her tone a mix of resistance and humor. Vasper laughed heartily, delighted by her stubbornness. The sound of his amusement was pure and genuine, revealing his perfect teeth and lighting up his already striking features. His affectionate gaze softened as he looked into her eyes, his expression warm enough to melt her defenses. Chanty found herself staring at him, her breath catching as she took in the breathtaking beauty of the man before her. His perfection was almost painful, a face that could shatter hearts, yet here he was, pouring his affection into her. He was the source of so much of her pain, and yet, she couldn't deny the magnetic pull that tethered her to him. Vasper noticed her dazed expression and stopped laughing, his focus shifting entirely to her. His eyes traveled from her face to her slightly parted lips, then back to her eyes, locking their gazes in an unspoken exchange. "You're getting more and more beautiful each day," Vasper whispered, his voice low and raspy, thick with emotion. His words startled Chanty, pulling her out of her trance. Embarrassment flooded her senses as warmth crept up her cheeks. She wasn't sure if she was blushing, but she felt the heat radiating from her face. In an attempt to escape the intensity of the moment, she shifted, trying to sit up and reach for her clothes. But Vasper was quicker. With gentle yet firm hands, he guided her back down, capturing her lips in another passionate kiss. As their lips parted, he trailed kisses down her body, moving lower and lower until he was between her legs again. Chanty gasped, her mouth falling open, though no sound escaped her lips. Vasper's tongue glided over her sensitive skin with deliberate precision, leaving no inch untouched. He savored every reaction, every tremble of her body beneath him, his eyes filled with worship as he watched her succumb to his touch. Lovingly, he pressed soft kisses to her thighs, his hands stroking her skin with reverence. "I can't get enough of this," he murmured, his voice a husky whisper against her. "You taste so good." Chanty's eyes fluttered open to meet his gaze, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to catch her breath. Her lips parted again, and this time, deep, guttural moans spilled from her, their raw intensity only fueling Vasper's desire. One of his hands cupped her breast, his fingers kneading gently, while his other hand joined his tongue, teasing her sensitive flesh with relentless skill. The overwhelming sensation sent Chanty's back arching off the mattress, her body writhing as if trying to escape the storm of pleasure yet desperately wanting more. Vasper didn't let up, his movements precise and unyielding. Chanty's cries grew louder, her body trembling as wave after wave of ecstasy overtook her. Her deep, resonant moans intertwined with Vasper's low, guttural groans, his voice urging her to let go, to surrender completely to the pleasure he was giving her. Her hands clutched the sheets beside her as her mind and body reached a fever pitch, completely overwhelmed by the sensations Vasper stirred within her. He continued expertly, guiding her higher and higher until her world shattered into a kaleidoscope of bliss. Chanty's thighs trembled uncontrollably as she spiraled closer to the peak of her ecstasy. Her deep, guttural moans mixed with her rapid breaths, her hips instinctively grinding against Vasper's eager face. Vasper, electrified by the sight of her writhing body and the bliss etched on her face, felt his desire surge further. He watched her unravel, consumed by the pleasure he delivered with meticulous skill. His tongue and fingers moved in a maddening, torturous rhythm, relentless and precise. Chanty's fingers clutched desperately at his hair, tugging as though to anchor herself amidst the storm of sensations. As she approached the brink, her lips parted, and she gasped his name, a deep, melodic moan that sent a rush of satisfaction through Vasper. Chanty's head tilted back, her mouth agape in a silent scream as her tightly shut eyes gave way to tears of unrestrained ecstasy. A guttural moan broke free from her lips, resonating with the sound of her release. Wave after wave of pleasure cascaded over her body, leaving her trembling and utterly spent. Even then, Vasper didn't stop. His tongue lingered, lapping at her tender, oversensitized skin, savoring every pulsation as she shuddered beneath him. His hands cupped her breasts, kneading them with a mix of tenderness and possessiveness, delighting in the way her body responded. Chanty, drained and unable to hold on any longer, let her fingers slip free from his hair as her arms fell limp at her sides. Vasper didn't rush. He pressed soft, lingering kisses to her trembling thighs, his lips brushing her skin with a reverence that spoke of his adoration. When her breathing began to even out, he allowed himself a satisfied smile, his gaze filled with longing and pride as he looked up at her. Slowly, Vasper moved up her body, his lips tracing every curve of her, from her stomach to her breasts, pausing to lavish her with kisses before continuing his path. He pressed a series of kisses along her neck, whispering promises only his heart could hear, before finally capturing her lips in a kiss so tender it melted away the last traces of her resistance. "You can sleep now." "Change later," he murmured against her lips, his voice a blend of command and affection. Gently, he lifted her damp hair, letting it fall delicately across the pillow. "I forgot to bring a hairdryer," he admitted softly, the faintest hint of humor in his tone. Chanty answered only with a soft, contented moan. Her half-lidded gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, Vasper saw the vulnerability and trust in her eyes before they fluttered shut completely. He stayed there, his eyes never leaving her as she drifted into the deep, restful sleep she so desperately needed. For a long time, Vasper lay beside her, his arms wrapped securely around her bare body. His eyes traced every curve, memorizing the sight of her at peace. "I can't describe the happiness I feel now that you're back in my arms," he whispered to himself, his voice filled with emotion. "Every fight, every struggle to win you back from Jake was worth it." He leaned down, pressing a feather-light kiss to her slightly parted lips. The sight of her sleeping so deeply, her exhaustion evident, filled him with both pride and tenderness. Smiling, he finally slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. He moved to his walk-in closet, dressing casually in a plain t-shirt and leather pants before heading to the kitchen. There, he began organizing the food he had brought from his house near Antarctica, placing everything neatly in the refrigerator. As he worked, his mind wandered to Chanty. What could he prepare for her when she woke? His eyes passed over a tray of steak, but he quickly dismissed it. Steak was tied to a painful memory, the dinner on the beach that reminded Chanty of Jake. He wouldn't let that shadow their time together. Then he spotted the salmon. His lips curved into a small smile as an idea formed. He began preparing the fish with care, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Every so often, he glanced back at the bed where Chanty lay, her naked body partially hidden by the sheets. His gaze softened as he approached her once more, standing by the bed and taking in the sight of her. "Look at that beautiful woman lying in your bed, Vasper Mondragon. She's yours now, and she will be your queen, ***, he murmured to himself, his voice low and full of awe. Reaching for the blanket, he paused for a moment, letting his eyes drink in the sight of her serene face and the curve of her body. With a mix of pride and possessiveness, he finally draped the blanket over her sleeping form, his hand lingering briefly before he returned to the kitchen. When Vasper had finished tending to the food in the fridge and finished cooking, a sudden jolt of awareness surged through him. His body tensed, sensing a powerful energy and an ominous presence. Alert, his gaze instinctively darted to Chanty, who lay peacefully asleep on the bed, her serene face untouched by the chaos beginning to unfold. Without a sound, 3 figures materialized beside him, their arrival swift and unnerving. It was Jake Valerian who stood directly before him, having teleported into the room, flanked by Jacob on his right and Lewis on his left. The moment unfolded in a blur. Before Vasper could react, Jacob swiftly clasped a suspended necklace around his neck. The impact was immediate and devastating. Vasper felt his strength drain away, the power that coursed through him vanishing like a snuffed flame. He staggered, weakened, just as Jake delivered a brutal punch to his stomach. The force of the blow sent Vasper to his knees, coughing up blood, writhing in pain as the torment coursed through his body. Jacob and Lewis stood watchfully, their expressions cold and detached, while Jake's gaze burned with a deadly intensity. Vasper's agonized groans echoed in the cave as he curled up on the cold, unforgiving floor. Jake's satisfaction was palpable, his eyes glinting with grim delight. Yet Vasper's own focus remained on Chanty, who still lay asleep on the bed, undisturbed by the violence. Jake's attention shifted, almost as if drawn by an unseen force, and he turned to look at Chanty. Jacob and Lewis followed suit, their eyes landing on her peaceful form. Jake's expression changed instantly, his heart twisting painfully in his chest. The sight of Chanty, sleeping so peacefully, stirred a storm within Jake. His mind raced, tortured by the vivid, agonizing thought of what might have transpired between her and Vasper on that very bed. The anguish he felt was so raw it seemed to physically constrict his chest, making it impossible to breathe. His emotions were a maelstrom, hurt, jealousy, and fury intertwined. Jacob and Lewis exchanged concerned glances, aware of Jake's turmoil. Despite the King of Sylvan Concord's decree that Chanty and Vasper Mondragon be united, Jake refused to accept it. To him, Chanty was still his wife, and no royal command could change that. He would never relinquish her to Vasper, even if she had chosen to return to him. Jacob, meanwhile, silently observed Chanty. Unlike Jake, Jacob bore his feelings with quiet resignation, having long suppressed his love for Chanty out of respect for Jake. Yet the lingering ache in his heart remained, etched deep into his soul. Unlike Jake or Vasper, Jacob wasn't possessive. He valued his duty as a guardian above all else, willing to sacrifice his own happiness for the greater good. But witnessing the scene before him stirred a pang of pain he couldn't entirely bury. Vasper, still curled on the floor, let out a bitter laugh, his voice thick with pain and defiance. "Coward, Jake," he spat, blood staining his lips. "You strike me only after I'm powerless? You have strength now, and I have none?" His laughter grew darker, a low, rasping sound that cut through the tension. He coughed violently, spitting more blood, yet his mocking gaze remained locked on Jake. Jake's fury deepened. Grabbing Vasper by the collar with one hand, he hoisted him off the ground as though he weighed nothing. Their eyes met, Vasper's wild and taunting despite his battered state, while Jake's burned with unrelenting rage. Vasper's lips curled into a maniacal grin, blood streaking his face and teeth. Even in defeat, he refused to yield. "Coward," he repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. Jake clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding audibly as his anger reached a boiling point. Jacob and Lewis, standing nearby, tightened their fists, their own fury at Vasper's audacity barely contained. Jake wiped the blood and spit from his face, his movements sharp and forceful, before hurling Vasper across the cave with terrifying strength. Vasper's body slammed against the cave wall with a resounding crash, the solid rock barely yielding to the impact. He collapsed onto the ground, the sound of his body hitting the stone floor echoing like thunder. A deep, guttural groan escaped Vasper as he lay sprawled in a pool of his own blood. His body twisted in agony, rolling feebly as waves of pain overtook him. A normal man would have been left with shattered bones or a broken spine, but Vasper endured, though his suffering was unmistakable. Jake, Jacob, and Lewis watched with no trace of pity, their cold expressions betraying nothing but grim satisfaction. Jake's lips curled into a smirk, dark and vindictive. If it weren't for his agreement with Zalora to deliver Vasper alive, he would have ended him right then and there. Outside the cave, Zalora waited atop her dragon, her presence looming as she prepared for the inevitable handover. But the tense silence was broken by Shanta's scream. Startled awake by the crash, she sat up, clutching a blanket around her bare body. Her wide, horrified eyes took in the bloodied and broken form of Vasper on the ground. Panic consumed her as she scrambled off the bed, hastily securing the blanket around her. Jake's heart clenched painfully as he watched her. The sight of her disheveled appearance, a clear sign of the intimate moments she had shared with Vasper, struck him like a blade. He remained silent, but his anguish was etched into every line of his face. Chanty, oblivious to Jake's torment, ran past him, tears streaming down her face as she called out Vasper's name. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to lift him into a more comfortable position. Vasper! Chanty's voice was choked with fear and sorrow as she cradled his bloodied form. Her tears mingled with his blood as she clung to him, desperate to protect him. Jake's fists clenched at his sides, the sight of Chanty's devotion to Vasper cutting him deeper than any wound. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a torment that felt like his very soul was being torn apart. Vasper weakly lifted a hand, his bloodied fingers brushing against Chanty's tear-streaked face. A faint, bitter smile played on his lips as his gaze met hers. Meanwhile, Jake stood frozen, consumed by the unbearable weight of his emotions, his love for Chanty colliding with the bitter reality of her choice. Chanty wiped the blood off Vasper's mouth and face with the blanket wrapped around her body. Tears streamed down her face, her sobs relentless as she cradled Vasper's half-limp body. Vasper groaned in pain, his breaths ragged. He knew something inside him had broken, bones fractured from the sheer force Jake had used when he hurled him across the cave wall. Deprived of his powers by the cursed suspended necklace clasped around his neck, Vasper was left as vulnerable as a mortal. Vasper! Chanty cried, her voice trembling as she held him tightly on the cold, blood-stained ground. Don't worry, Vasper rasped, his voice weak yet laced with defiance. I'll be fine. I can heal myself, as long as the suspended necklace is gone. Stop crying, Chanty. Please. Despite the pain contorting his face, he tried to reassure her, grateful that he hadn't passed out. Chanty glanced at the cursed necklace around Vasper's neck before turning her tear-filled gaze toward Jake, who stood watching, silent and imposing. Take it off, Jake. Remove the suspended necklace. He needs his powers to heal. What have you done? She pleaded desperately, her voice cracking. Jake clenched his jaw, his fists trembling at his sides. The anguish in his heart felt unbearable, as if the heavens themselves had collapsed upon him. Chanty's love for Vasper was unmistakable, her every expression, every action spoke volumes. Unable to bear the sight, Lewis and Jacob stepped away toward the cascading water at the edge of the cave, their backs turned to Jake, who was now trembling as silent tears streamed down his face. Chanty continued sobbing as she gazed at Vasper, her hand gently caressing his bloodied face, filled with compassion and unyielding devotion. Jake, she pleaded again, her voice breaking. Please, let him go. Release him, Jake. Jake's body remained still, his face stoic yet devastated. But his eyes betrayed his agony, brimming with unshed tears. His tall, commanding figure radiated power, but his expression was one of utter defeat, a man broken by love. He looked as though he had lost everything, his sorrow cutting deeper than death itself. From where he lay, Vasper watched the exchange silently, his sharp eyes taking in the thick tension in the air. He could feel the turbulent emotions between Jake and Chanty, the storm of love, anger, and pain that swirled in the room. Jake, Chanty's voice finally broke the silence. Her tone was soft but resolute, her words piercing through the sound of the waterfall cascading in the background. Jake's lips trembled as he finally spoke, his words weighted by despair and longing. I'm still your husband, Chanty, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Each word felt like a boulder tumbling from his chest. I won't let go. I can't let go. Even if Vasper Mondragon has taken you time and again. I don't care. You're still my wife. I'm still waiting for you to come back to me. His tone was tender, filled with raw affection, but his plea carried the weight of his broken heart. I don't care what the king decrees. I won't give you back to Vasper. Never. Chanty's chest tightened, her heart caught in a storm of guilt and love as she gazed at Jake. The pain etched on his face tore at her, yet the love she felt for Vasper overwhelmed her heart, weighing heavier than the remnants of her bond with Jake. Jake, please, she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Let him go. Please, Jake. I'm begging you. Let him go so he can heal. Her desperation, her unwavering concern for Vasper, cut deeper than any blade into Jake's already shattered soul. She didn't even acknowledge the words he had spoken moments ago. All that mattered to her was Vasper. Jacob stepped forward, his movements slow but purposeful. He turned to face Jake, his eyes reflecting the same sorrow and understanding. It was clear to both brothers now, Vasper Mondragon meant more to Chanty than anything else in the world. Jacob's footsteps echoed through the cave as he drew closer to Jake, his tall figure exuding quiet power. His expression, though restrained, carried the weight of his pain. His love for Chanty remained buried deep within him, unspoken and unacknowledged, but its mark was etched into his very soul. Meanwhile, Vasper, despite his pain and weakness, managed a faint, triumphant smile. He could feel it, the priority he held in Chanty's heart. "Well," he murmured, his voice barely audible but laced with bitter humor, "at least I managed to cook before all this happened." His feeble laugh turned into a sharp gasp as pain surged through his body, yet he couldn't help but let out a faint chuckle at his own grim joke. Jake's pain and fury deepened when he saw Chanty tenderly caress Vasper's cheek and plant a lingering kiss on his lips. Unable to contain himself, Jake stormed toward her, his movements quick and decisive. He grabbed Chanty, pulling her upright, while Louis and Jacob hoisted Vasper's weakened body from the ground. Chanty's heart raced as she panicked, her wide, tear-filled eyes darting between Jake and Vasper. "Jake! Where are you taking him?" "Let him go, Jake, please," she begged, her voice breaking as she struggled in his grip. Jake ignored her cries, his expression cold and unyielding. Vasper, head bowed, offered no resistance as Louis and Jacob carried him toward the cave entrance. "What are you going to do?" Chanty screamed, her voice laced with fear and desperation. "Let him go, Jacob. Louis. Please, I'm begging you. Have mercy." Her pleas dissolved into sobs, her body trembling violently as she fought against Jake's iron grip. Jake held her tightly, his powerful arms wrapping around her in an unrelenting embrace. Even her arms were pinned, leaving her unable to break free. Chanty writhed in his hold, her cries echoing through the cave. Vasper, sensing her distress, turned his head weakly to look back. His eyes, sharp with defiance, locked onto Jake's. The sight of Jake holding Chanty enraged him, his voice rising in a growl. "Jake! Let her go!" Jake didn't respond, his jaw set in silence. Vasper tried again, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Babe, change into something. You're barely dressed." Jake heard the term of endearment, babe, and it struck him like a dagger to the heart. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips, though it was laced with anguish. "Babe. That's what they call each other," he thought, the pain twisting in his chest. Louis and Jacob exchanged a tense glance, the weight of the situation heavy between them. Without warning, they carried Vasper to the edge of the waterfall, their movements deliberate and unyielding. And then, they threw him. "No. No. Vasper!" Chanty's scream tore through the cave as she watched Vasper disappear over the edge, swallowed by the thundering cascade. Her heart pounded with terror, her mind reeling. The rushing waters below were wild and unforgiving, and Vasper's weakened state left him defenseless. "Jake! Let me go! Let me go! I have to save him!" Chanty cried, thrashing against his hold. She imagined Vasper drowning, his body battered by the powerful current. Her panic escalated, her voice growing hoarse from screaming. Jake, stoic and unmoving, ignored her pleas. Louis and Jacob turned back to Jake, their expressions grim. "We'll head out now. Follow when you're ready," they said before leaping over the falls themselves. Chanty froze, her breath catching as she stared in disbelief. Her mind raced. Did they follow Vasper? Did they throw themselves into the water to save him? "Jake, please," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her face. "Let me go. You have no heart. Vasper can't swim in his condition. He's too weak." Jake said nothing. Instead, he carried Chanty to the nearby bed and placed her down firmly. She immediately tried to rise, her focus still on the waterfall, but Jake was faster. He caught her and tossed her back onto the bed. "Get dressed. We're going back to the tent," he commanded, his tone cold and unyielding, his eyes burning with suppressed emotion. But Chanty refused to listen. She stood again, her determination unwavering, and moved toward the falls. Once more, Jake intercepted her, catching her mid-step and throwing her back onto the bed. She bounced against the mattress but rose again, only for Jake to repeat his action, his frustration growing with every attempt. This cycle continued until Chanty's strength gave out, her sobs echoing in the cave as she finally collapsed onto the bed, defeated and trembling. "Please," she begged, her voice raw and broken. "Let me help him, Jake. Please." Her tear-streaked face and shaking form were too much for Jake to bear. His anger flared, and in one swift motion, he pushed her back onto the bed, not roughly, but with enough force to keep her there. He climbed over her, pinning her in place. Chanty froze, her heart racing as their eyes locked. Jake's piercing gaze burned into hers, filled with anguish, fury, and something else, something she couldn't name. The intensity of the moment left her breathless, her panic rising as she lay trapped beneath him. Her body trembled, her pulse pounding like a war drum in her chest. Chanty's feelings for Jake had changed, they were no longer the same as before. Jake's voice, low and laced with bitterness, broke the tense silence. "Does he own you now?" he asked quietly. Without warning, his hand slid down, finding its way to the sensitive flesh between her thighs. Chanty gasped audibly, her breath catching in shock. Jake's finger moved, sliding gently inside, his actions unrelenting. Chanty's body jolted in protest, tears streaming down her face. "Jake! Please, stop," she begged, her voice breaking with desperation. Jake's face betrayed the pain in his chest, his emotions etched deeply into his features. "Stop? Why? You're my wife, Chanty. I'm still your husband, we're still married," he said, his tone steady but seething with suppressed anguish. With a sudden motion, he pulled away the thin blanket covering her, exposing Chanty's bare chest to his view. "Aren't these mine?" he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Lowering his head, he captured her breasts with his mouth, alternating between them, his lips and tongue exploring. All the while, his finger continued its movements, sending waves of sensation through Chanty's trembling body. Helpless beneath him, Chanty sobbed uncontrollably, her strength entirely drained. Her body lay limp, tears flowing freely as she endured Jake's actions, unable to summon the will to resist further. But when Jake lifted his gaze and saw Chanty's tear-streaked face, something in him shifted. He froze, his expression softening as realization dawned. Slowly, as if in a trance, he covered her chest again, pulling the blanket over her trembling body. Gently, he withdrew his hand from between her thighs, his movements cautious and filled with regret. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face, but Chanty refused to meet his gaze. She turned her head away, her tear-filled eyes fixated on the wall. Her silence was deafening, a resignation that pierced through Jake's heart. She had given up, no longer willing to argue with him. She had accepted that Jake couldn't yet let go of his pain, his refusal to accept her choices weighing heavily on both of them. The silence hung between them like a fragile thread until Chanty, sensing that Jake had stopped, dared to look at him. When their eyes met, she saw the glimmer of tears in his. Jake's emotions spilled over, tears streaming down his face and landing softly on her cheek. Quickly, he wiped them away with his hand, as if ashamed of his vulnerability. "Why is fate so unfair to me?" Jake's voice trembled with anguish. "After I was given a moment with you, you were taken away from me just as quickly." His voice cracked, and he clenched his fists as if trying to suppress the pain threatening to overwhelm him. Chanty's fierce expression didn't waver. Her thoughts weren't on Jake but on Vasper, the man she had seen thrown from the waterfall. "Jake, I have to save Vasper. Please," she said firmly, her voice devoid of sympathy for his pain. Jake's jaw tightened at her words, his expression hardening. "He's with Zalora now. When we threw him into the waterfall, Zalora and Dagon were waiting for him outside," he said coldly, his eyes locking with Chanty's as if daring her to question him. Chanty's heart sank, her eyes widening in panic. Her mind raced, questions flooding her thoughts. "Where did Zalora take him?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with worry. Jake said nothing, his irritation mounting as Chanty's concern for Vasper grew evident. He's wearing the suspended necklace, Jake. He can't heal his body while he's wearing it, she cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled, her fear for Vasper consuming her. You have no right to question what Zalora does with Vasper, Jake snapped, his voice cold and sharp. His irritation was palpable, his expression tightening as jealousy and frustration overtook him. Why did you hurt him, Jake? Chanty's voice was soft, almost a whisper. Her tear-filled eyes pleaded with him. Jake let out a bitter chuckle, the sound laced with venom. Do you really need to ask me why? His teeth clenched as he spoke, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. If it were up to me, I'd erase him from your life in an instant. His voice carried the weight of his anguish, and his eyes burned with a mix of resentment and heartbreak. Chanty could only look at him, tears silently streaming down her face as her heart broke for the man he had become. Tears streamed quietly from Jake's eyes, glistening in the light. Before they could fall onto Chanty's cheek, he abruptly rose, his movements heavy with purpose. He sat on the edge of the bed, his presence commanding, his stance rigid. His expression was stern, his voice firm as he spoke. Get dressed. We're going back to the tent. David's waiting, Jake said without looking at her. He stood, his back to Chanty. She quickly scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she opened her suitcase. Pulling out a jogger and a jacket, she dressed hurriedly, her eyes flicking nervously to Jake's broad back. As she finished, she noticed how much longer his hair had grown. It was another reminder of how time had changed him. Jake turned to face her. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a weight to it that made Chanty's chest tighten. Slowly, he approached her, pulling something out of his pocket. When he reached her, he gently took her left hand and slid their sapphire wedding ring back onto her finger. You're still my wife, no matter what happens. Don't return this ring to me, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Even the mansion, it's yours now. Whatever happens to me, everything I have will be yours. Chanty stood frozen, her gaze fixed on Jake. She didn't understand the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her, but tears welled in her eyes and spilled over. Something in his tone and his demeanor felt like a goodbye. Jake, why are you talking like this? She asked, her voice trembling, her chest heavy with unspoken fears. She looked down at the wedding ring, memories of their life together flooding her mind. The pain of their shared history resurfaced like a wound reopening. Jake met her gaze but didn't answer. Instead, he continued, his tone detached but full of hidden sorrow. Don't worry. David knows everything. He'll take care of things if anything happens to me. Isn't this what you saw in the prophecy of the Sword of Destiny? He smiled faintly, but it was tinged with bitterness. I hope it's true. So that my suffering in this world can finally end. I don't plan to linger if this is how things are going to be. I'd rather disappear than see you in Vasper's arms. His voice, though steady, betrayed the pain coursing through him. Chanty's tears fell harder, her heart shattering at his words. Jake. That's not what I want for you. Please, Jake, it's not like that, she pleaded, gripping his hand tightly, hoping he would understand her desperation. Jake's gaze softened, though tears now brimmed in his own eyes. You can't understand how I feel, Chanty, he said, his voice cracking. It's clear to me now, you love him more. No matter what I do, I can't change how you feel about him. He's the one in your heart, and I can't accept that, no matter how hard I try. It would kill me to see you by his side. What's the point of living if I'm only going to suffer every day? His words broke her further, his anguish bleeding into the space between them. Chanty sobbed, her cries echoing in the room. Jake continued, his voice trembling. You refuse to agree with the king's plan. That means you don't want to come back to me. Isn't that right? His fists clenched as he struggled to voice his emotions. I'd rather end it all than live like this. You'll never understand how deeply this cuts me. Jake, Chanty whispered through her tears, her voice a broken apology. I'm so sorry. I'm not the woman you deserve. There's someone out there who will love you the way you love me. Someone who can return your love fully, Jake. Jake let out a bitter, hollow laugh. No, Chanty, he said softly, shaking his head. I know myself. There will never be another woman I can love more than you. Only you. It's always been you. He sighed, his shoulders sagging as he lowered his head. And besides, I'm tired. Tired of my duties as a guardian. I never chose this life, and there's no escape for me except to leave this world. You were my only light, my only joy. But even that was taken from me. Jake's voice softened further as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss on the wedding ring he had placed back on her finger. If I force my happiness, it'll only bring you sadness. I don't want that for you. I'm sorry for the times I pushed myself onto you, Chanty. But thank you for the small moments of happiness you gave me. His voice trembled with raw emotion, and before Chanty could respond, she threw herself into his arms, clutching him tightly. She sobbed uncontrollably against his chest, her cries filled with the weight of everything unsaid, of a love that could never fully mend their broken hearts. Jake, forgive me. Please forgive me, Chanty repeated, her voice cracking with desperation as tears streamed down her face. Jake held her tightly, his embrace fierce and unyielding, as if it might be their last. He kissed her hair tenderly, his lips lingering as their sobs echoed through the cavern, magnifying the weight of their emotions. No, my love. You've done nothing wrong. None of this is your fault, Jake whispered, his voice trembling. I should be the one asking for forgiveness. Jake, I don't want to lose you. I don't want the prophecy to come true, Chanty pleaded, her tears blurring her vision. You can avoid it. You can leave, Jake. You don't have to face this. But Jake remained silent, his face etched with sorrow. Minutes passed as they clung to each other, unwilling to let go. Finally, Jake gently pulled away and wiped Chanty's tears with his hands. Jake, please, Chanty begged, her voice cracking. Change your mind. Don't get involved in my fight. Stay away from Velantis. Jake offered her a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. If you agree to the king's plan, my love, I won't go to Velantis. Chanty froze, her words caught in her throat. She stared into his eyes, searching for a glimmer of hope, but Jake's smile turned bitter. Don't worry, he said softly. I won't force you. I've known from the start that you'd never agree to the king's plan. I respect your decision. All I ask is that you respect mine. Jake. Chanty began, but before she could say more, Jake captured her lips in a sudden, passionate kiss. His arms enveloped her, pulling her close, but Chanty didn't respond. She stood motionless, her body stiff like a statue, as Jake poured his heart into the kiss. When their lips finally parted, Jake smiled again, this time with a bittersweet finality. This might be our last kiss, don't you think? There are only a few hours left until twilight. Chanty stared at him, her mind reeling, unable to find her voice. Thank you, Jake whispered, his tone heavy with unspoken pain. Chanty wanted to stop him, to find the words that might change his mind, but they refused to come. She felt paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Mar is already at the tent, and Lauren is there too, Jake said, his voice back to its composed tone. Don't mind her, okay? Let's go. Chanty lowered her gaze, staring at their wedding ring on her finger. Before she could respond, the ground beneath them shifted. The cavern's surroundings dissolved, and in the blink of an eye, they were in the tent. Chanty found herself in a room with a new bed that hadn't been there before. Sorry, Jake said, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. The bed was broken, so I replaced it with a new one. Chanty said nothing, her gaze still fixed downward. Jake let go of her hand and gestured toward the table. Mara's prepared your food. You still have time to rest, he said before turning toward the door. Jake, Chanty called softly. He paused and glanced back at her, but Chanty's voice faltered. She couldn't find the words, and Jake resumed walking. The door closed behind him, leaving Chanty alone. She felt her knees weaken as fresh tears fell, her mind spinning with uncertainty. What should she do? How could she change Jake's decision? The weight of fate pressed down on her, forcing her to consider the impossible choice. Who should live, Jake or Vasper? She wanted Jake to live, to continue his life, but how could she make that happen? Suddenly, an idea came to her. With a determined expression, she called for Mara. Mara entered the room, her eyes falling briefly on Chanty's hand, where the sapphire ring sat once more. It was clear to her that Jake had returned it. She chose not to comment and waited for Chanty's instructions. "I need a pen and paper," Chanty whispered, her voice urgent but quiet. She was wary of the heightened hearing abilities of Jake and the other guardians outside. Mara handed her the items, then stood silently as Chanty began to write. Once Chanty finished, she folded the paper and handed it to Mara, motioning for her to read it silently. Mara nodded as she scanned the note, her lips pressing into a knowing smile. After a moment, Chanty took the paper back and tore it into tiny pieces. She threw the scraps into the trash, ensuring no trace remained. Mara nodded again, understanding Chanty's plan. Without a word, she bowed slightly and left the room. Left alone, Chanty paced back and forth, her hands clenched tightly as her mind raced. What could she do to stop Jake? She had no idea if her hastily devised plan would work, but she clung to the hope that it might. Suddenly, David's voice broke through her thoughts, calling her name from outside. "Come in, David," Chanty said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. David entered the room, his expression serious. Chanty took a deep breath, readying herself for the conversation that might change everything. The twilight reckoning, long anticipated by all in the inner world, had finally arrived. Chanty at the center, surrounded by the 7 guardians and some of the elite warriors of the Sylvan Concord, their stances radiated a commanding presence of power and domination. Chanty, clad in her combat uniform bearing the emblem of the Sylvan Concord on her chest, looked every bit the warrior. The material of her attire was akin to leather but lacked its usual heat and discomfort. It felt almost weightless on her body, granting unparalleled ease while remaining impervious to ordinary swords or any sharp weaponry. Her uniform fit like a second skin, accentuating her hourglass figure to perfection. Although it offered unmatched protection, Chanty couldn't help but wish she were wearing her preferred jogger jacket and pants, which felt more like casual fashion than battle gear. Still, her unease wasn't solely due to her attire, it stemmed from the way Jake's eyes lingered on her. She was acutely aware of the effect she had on him, a fact she had long sought to suppress. Jacob, too, struggled to keep his gaze steady, though Chanty appreciated that his feelings for her never caused complications. Occasionally, Jake would catch Jacob stealing glances at her, resulting in a silent yet intense rivalry between the two men. However, Jacob respected Jake deeply and fought against the temptation to stare at Chanty for too long. Chanty's beauty had captivated Jacob from the start, but now, having entered the inner world and undergone the elite golden bath ritual exclusive to Sylvan Concord's women, her allure had become even more radiant. Jake wanted to approach her but restrained himself, knowing better than to act impulsively. Chanty gestured discreetly to Mara, signaling her need for a rubber band to tie her hair. Mara nodded in acknowledgement and fetched the item. They were seated around the round table, and Chanty's eyes followed Mara as if waiting for something more. When Mara returned, she handed over the rubber band with a folded piece of paper tucked discreetly alongside it. Chanty, careful to mask her curiosity, slipped the paper under the table and began reading it. She glanced around to ensure no one noticed. Her companions, Marco on her left and David on her right, sat too far to see what she was doing. As she unfolded the note and read its contents, her heart raced, her chest tightening with worry. The message confirmed her worst fears. Vasper Mondragon had been taken to the Dragon's Cave by Zalora, just as the prophecy foretold by the Sword of Destiny had predicted. Her hands trembled as she tore the paper into tiny pieces, though her expression betrayed her inner turmoil. Chanty passed the fragments back to Mara, both of them moving with meticulous care to avoid drawing attention. Chanty fought back tears that threatened to spill as her thoughts lingered on Vasper. She wanted nothing more than to rescue him, but how? The Guardians kept a watchful eye on her, and she had no idea how to breach the Dragon Mountains, the impenetrable stronghold of the dragons. Running her fingers through her hair, she gathered it into a high ponytail in a gesture both deliberate and absent-minded. Unbeknownst to her, this simple action mesmerized both Jake and Jacob. They were captivated as strands of Chanty's hair brushed against her face, enhancing her ethereal beauty. Jake, stealing a glance at Jacob, caught him staring again and gave him a sharp look. Jacob noticed too late, returning Jake's glare with quiet defiance. Though the tension between them was palpable, Jacob knew he couldn't compete with Jake. It wasn't his place to pursue Chanty, no matter how entrancing she was. He reminded himself that her beauty and grace likely inspired admiration in many, not just him. The guardians, however, were well aware of Jacob's feelings for Chanty. They knew he had confessed his love for her but had chosen his duty as a guardian over personal desires. His adherence to their laws earned him their respect. Marco and Justin, seated nearby, exchanged knowing glances, their silent observations betraying their amusement at the unfolding drama. Even Jake couldn't miss the subtle signs of Chanty's unease. He had noticed her reading something under the table, and her restless movements hadn't escaped his attention. Though he didn't know the contents of the note, it was clear to him that Chanty was deeply troubled. Jake watched Chanty closely, his curiosity piqued by the tension in her expression. He wanted desperately to have a moment alone with her to talk, but the circumstances left no room for such an opportunity. Their eyes suddenly met across the table, and Jake silently wished the connection wouldn't break. Yet, to his dismay, Chanty looked away and turned her attention to David. "David, can we talk alone? Maybe in the vehicle, just the two of us?" Chanty's voice cut through David's conversation with a general from the Sylvan Concord army seated beside him. David excused himself from the general and turned to Chanty, his gaze serious as they locked eyes. Jake, on the other hand, remained seated, his sharp eyes following them. His heightened senses caught every word, and his focus sharpened. Chanty noticed Jake's intense stare and hesitated momentarily before falling silent under the weight of it. David glanced briefly at Jake, then stood up abruptly. "Let's go," he said, gesturing for Chanty to follow him. She rose from her seat, her movements magnetic and effortlessly drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Eyes followed her, captivated by her presence, and even Lauren, seated on a sofa away from the round table, scowled with jealousy. Lauren's envy wasn't just about Chanty's connection with Vasper. She silently admitted that Chanty was more beautiful than her, a truth she couldn't ignore. Before Chanty's arrival in the inner world, Lauren Valerian had been the most celebrated elite woman of Sylvan Concord, admired for her beauty and grace. The only woman she had ever acknowledged as her superior was Zalora, whom she idolized for her contributions to the inner world's harmony. Zalora's neutrality across kingdoms and passion for the preservation of flora and fauna of the inner world earned her the title Princess of the Inner World. But everything changed with Chanty's arrival. Lauren felt like an ordinary woman in comparison, especially with Vasper Mondragon now trailing after Chanty like her shadow. As David and Chanty stepped outside, Lauren failed to notice that Jake had been glancing her way. Jake observed the sharp, resentful look his cousin cast toward Chanty. He understood Lauren's jealousy all too well but didn't sympathize. Despite their blood relation, he had no fondness for Lauren and didn't get along with her. Lauren was present only at the request of a prince allied with Sylvan Concord, and Jake tolerated her presence out of necessity. Still, his restlessness grew as he watched David and Chanty leave, wanting to follow them. The other guardians, however, had their eyes on Jake, fully aware of his intentions. Justin turned to Lauren, catching her eye for a moment. He smiled at her, but Lauren didn't even spare him a polite nod. She turned away and returned to reading a magazine. Justin, visibly disappointed, lowered his gaze back to the table. Marco, noticing Justin's rejection, chuckled softly and commented, "If Jake can't get along with his own cousin, what makes you think you stand a chance?" Embarrassed, Justin stole a glance at Jake, knowing he had overheard Marco's remark. Jake, however, showed no reaction, his expression unreadable. Unable to suppress his unease any longer, Jake stood up abruptly and muttered something about heading to the bathroom. The 5 guardians exchanged knowing looks. "Don't do anything reckless, Jake," Justin murmured, his voice barely audible but loud enough for Jake's heightened senses to pick up. Jake ignored him, walking away without a backward glance. As he passed Lauren, he didn't acknowledge her, and she, in turn, didn't spare him a glance. Their mutual indifference impressed the other guardians, who exchanged amused glances and shook their heads. "Those two really are cut from the same cloth, huh?" Gabriel remarked. "Same bloodline, same attitude." The guardians laughed quietly, knowing full well that Jake could hear them. Their laughter was cut short by a loud crash from outside. Their heightened senses immediately pinpointed its source, the vehicle where David and Chanty had gone to talk. Without hesitation, the guardians rushed out to investigate. When they arrived, the commotion was unmistakable. Inside the vehicle, Jake was in a rage, and the noise was from him striking the interior. They could hear David shouting at Jake, Chanty's sobs cutting through the chaos. Jacob clenched his fists in fury at the sight, blue flames dancing on his fingertips as he barely restrained himself. He approached the vehicle, his expression dark. "Stay out of it, Jacob. We've got this," David said firmly, stepping out of the vehicle to address him. Jacob's rage was evident, but David's calm yet commanding tone made him pause. Inside the vehicle, Jake was holding Chanty, pleading for forgiveness as her tears fell freely. Outside, Jacob glared at the door, his anger still simmering. David sighed heavily, watching Jake and Chanty through the window. He couldn't entirely blame Jake for the complicated situation, but as a guardian, Jake had violated the code of conduct by pursuing a romantic relationship with someone he was meant to protect. Jake had already broken the rules by marrying Chanty in the outer world, with David secretly helping him. But now, the consequences of those actions weighed heavily on them all. David ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Jake, this is the last time I'm giving you time alone with Chanty. 15 minutes. No more," David said with authority. "We need to leave soon, twilight is almost here. Get back to the tent when you're done." Ushering Jacob away from the scene. Jake and Chanty remained inside, the atmosphere heavy. Chanty's sobs had subsided, and Jake wiped away her tears gently. Chanty struggled to compose herself in front of Jake, dabbing away her tears with trembling hands. Jake wrapped his arms around her waist, his eyes brimming with remorse as he gazed at her. The guilt in his heart gnawed at him, brought on by his earlier outburst of anger, punching the chair and storming off after David had tried to stop him from speaking with Chanty, and attempting to break free from David's restraint. That confrontation had shaken Chanty to her core, her fear and worry spilling out as tears, that Jake and David might come to blows. "Jake," Chanty began, her voice quivering with urgency, "I don't want to see you fighting with your comrades, especially not with David. He's like a brother to me, the only family I've recognized in this world who's connected to my father." Chanty said, her voice trembling with earnestness. "Please, Jake, I don't want the two of you to fight. You're both important to me." Her eyes pleaded with him, her expression an open cry for understanding, and he could see her sincerity and desperation. Chanty pressed on, her voice gentle yet firm. "Don't forget, Jake, David helped us even when it was forbidden. He made sure we could marry, knowing full well the risks. He did that because we matter to him. Because you matter to him." Jake's remorse was palpable, etched across his face. He looked down, ashamed of his actions. "I'm so sorry, my love," he whispered. "I know sometimes I can't control my temper, and I know how much David has sacrificed for us. But how can I accept being forbidden to talk to my wife? Why is it so hard for me to speak with my own wife? With you?" His voice cracked, the words almost too painful to force out. Chanty turned away, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to meet Jake's anguished gaze. "I missed you so much," he murmured, his voice barely audible, laced with longing and pain. Carrying the weight of a shattered soul. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Chanty placed her hands over Jake's chest as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I want to take you away," he whispered fiercely. "I want to whisk you off to our mansion, our beach house, or even the yacht, just the two of us. But I know, it's not possible. Why does fate have to be so cruel to me?" His voice broke with anguish, the rawness in his tone cutting through the moment like a blade, laden with anguish, each word a testament to his despair. Chanty couldn't bear to add to his pain. She stayed silent, her quiet sobs the only response to Jake's despairing words. Jake lifted her face gently, his hands cradling her tear-streaked cheeks. "Why is it a sin to love you?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion as their eyes met. He cupped Chanty's tear-streaked face in his hands, his eyes locking with hers. His gaze was intense, filled with both love and sorrow. Slowly, he leaned in, capturing her lips with his own in a kiss filled with passion, love, and a longing that seemed to consume him, pouring every ounce of his longing and love into it. Their lips lingered together. Though Chanty didn't respond, she didn't resist either. Her compassion for Jake burned brightly, mingling with the love she held for him, a part of her heart he had claimed. Despite everything, a part of her heart still belonged to him, a love she could never fully extinguish. As their lips parted, Jake wiped away her tears with his fingers, their gazes locked in an unbroken connection. "I'm so sorry, my love," he whispered, his warm breath brushing her skin. Chanty allowed him to express his feelings, not wanting to interrupt the fragile moment between them, unwilling to interrupt his heartfelt confession. She didn't want to prolong their conversation, but she also couldn't bring herself to silence him. Jake took Chanty's hand, the one bearing her wedding ring, and lifted it to his lips, pressing a tender kiss on it. "I know what you asked Mara to do," he said softly, his voice laced with both sadness and understanding. Chanty froze, her heart pounding violently in her chest as shock overtook her. Her eyes darted restlessly, betraying her unease as Jake's penetrating gaze held hers, deep and piercing, filled with meaning. "I followed Mara." "She didn't notice," Jake continued, his tone calm yet deliberate. Chanty's breathing quickened as panic set in, her chest tightening as her lips trembled uncontrollably. "Was the sleeping wine you asked Mara to prepare meant for me?" Jake's question hung heavily in the air, cutting through the silence like a blade, his voice steady but probing. Chanty's wide eyes gave her away, the truth written all over her face, the truth she tried to conceal now laid bare. Jake smiled faintly, amused by her reaction. Jake's small, knowing smile confirmed his suspicions. "Jake, what are you talking about?" Chanty stammered, her voice trembling as she attempted to deny it. She was a terrible liar, and Jake knew it. Jake chuckled softly, amused by her futile attempt to deny it. "You're such a terrible liar, my love," he teased, his voice warmed despite the situation, leaning in to steal another kiss, this time more gently. But Chanty, irritated by being caught, pushed him away abruptly, her hands shoving against his chest, her reaction betraying her frustration. Jake chuckled softly at her annoyance. "If I had drunk the wine Mara handed me earlier, I'd probably be asleep by now," he teased. With a smirk. Chanty turned her head away, desperate to deny it but unable to form the words. She couldn't think of an excuse. Jake gently ran his hand through her hair, his touch soft and reassuring. "Don't worry. I'm not angry. I understand why you did it," he said tenderly, in a calm, soothing tone. Chanty looked up at him, her emotions a whirlwind. "Jake, don't go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Pleading. Jake's demeanor shifted, his expression growing serious. "I won't if you choose me," he replied softly. Chanty froze, her tears threatening to spill again. Frustration bubbled inside her, and she couldn't hold it back. She was angry at Jake for forcing her to choose. "Jake, why do you have to make me choose? Can't you just stay alive, and we remain friends?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, her gaze pleading for his understanding. Jake let out a bitter laugh, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Friends? You and me, as just friends?" he asked, shaking his head, his laugh turning into a hollow chuckle. "How could we ever be just friends, Chanty? When every time I see you, I want to hold you, kiss you, and make you mine. I want to hold you every time I sleep. Is that what you call friendship? That's not what friends do." Chanty stood frozen, staring at Jake. She remained silent. "We can't be just friends," Jake said, his voice trembling with an undeniable finality. "Not when my thoughts and my heart are always consumed by you. That's something that will never change. There are things in this world that we cannot alter, and my feelings for you are one of them." His words were resolute, his tone and expression revealed the depth of his emotions. Tears streamed down Chanty's face as she responded, her voice soft but steady, "And I can't change how I feel about Vasper, Jake." Her words sliced through the silence, leaving a gaping chasm between them. Jake said nothing, and they gazed at each other in silence. Neither of them spoke. Their eyes locked in an unspoken battle, their hearts pounding wildly, filled with pain, heartbreak, love, and a lingering sense of pity. It was a cruel twist of fate, like oil and water. No matter how hard you stir, they could never mix, no matter how hard they tried. Jake finally broke their shared silence, lowering his gaze to her hand, where the wedding ring glinted faintly. He traced the ring with his thumb, his shoulders heavy with despair. "Only a miracle will decide if I deserve to live or not," he whispered, his voice tinged with defeat, his words cutting through Chanty like a blade. She felt her heart ache at his words. She desperately wanted Jake to live, to move forward, to go on with his life, to find peace. But the plan she devised, the one she never imagined he would discover, her last resort, was something she hadn't anticipated Jake finding out about. Now seemed like a cruel betrayal. A knock on the vehicle door shattered their fragile moment. David called from outside the vehicle, breaking the tension. 15 minutes are up, Jake." His voice was calm but firm. Both Chanty and Jake heard it, and Chanty immediately turned to leave, walking toward the door without looking back at him. She avoided looking at Jake as she stepped out. She kept her gaze forward, her emotions tumultuous. Disheartened by his decision, she walked straight to David. She felt a sting of resentment, though she didn't dare voice it. She walked briskly toward the tent with David, leaving Jake behind in the vehicle. Inside, Jake sat in stillness, his expression stern, his fists clenched tightly, staring around the confined space. The silence in the vehicle seemed to amplify the words Chanty had spoken moments earlier. Chanty's final words about her unchanging feelings for Vasper Mondragon echoed in his mind. Those words shattered Jake's world, crushing him with their finality. The truth devastated him, shattering the foundations of his world. The will to live drained from him, leaving him empty. Joy and hope drained from him. He felt like a man without a soul, devoid of purpose. The future seemed bleak, empty, and utterly devoid of light. Jake leaned back heavily in his seat, his body heavy with despair, his head tilted back, eyes closed, legs spread apart, his body weighed down by an unbearable heaviness. He sank into the chair, his mind spiraling into darkness. Suddenly, the vehicle door swung open, snapping Jake out of his daze. Startled, he sat up, his eyes darting to the figure entering. It was Lauren. His cousin stormed in with a fiery determination, her expression fiery and defiant. Jake raised an eyebrow, surprised by her unexpected arrival, but he didn't move, remained seated, watching her serious expression. He simply stared at her, his eyes questioning. "Jake," Lauren snapped, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. "Are you seriously this pathetic? Useless? You're just going to hand your wife over to Vasper Mondragon? Is that it? Just like that?" Her words were sharp, laced with disdain. "You could renounce your citizenship in the inner world, and live with Chanty in the outer world after this twilight reckoning, and be done with it. Isn't that an option? Couldn't you? What are you so afraid of? Losing your fortune here? Even if you lived to 500 years old, your wealth in the outer world wouldn't run out." Lauren spat, her tone sharp and biting, direct and merciless. Jake stared at her, speechless. Lauren's words came rapid and unfiltered, striking him with brutal honesty. "Let me be clear, Jake. I want you to fight for Chanty, keep her away from Vasper Mondragon. I hate her. She's like Vasper's shadow, always hanging around him. You know I want Vasper, but because of her, he doesn't even look at me." Lauren's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. "I'm furious at your wife. If it were up to me, I'd shave her head. Don't make me reach the point where I lose all patience with her, Jake. I'm so angry I could rip her hair out if it were up to me. Don't make me despise her even more." With that, Lauren spun on her heel. Without waiting for Jake's response, Lauren turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her with a force that made it shudder. Jake watched in stunned silence as she stormed out. He remained in his seat, speechless, his mouth slightly open in shock. He sighed deeply and shook his head, unable to believe his cousin's audacity. What a vile personality, he muttered to himself. He couldn't fathom how someone in his own family could harbor such venom. Outside, Justin had overheard everything, standing near the back of the vehicle. He had followed Lauren out of the tent and caught every word of her tirade. As Lauren disappeared from sight, Justin stood motionless, his chest tight with an unexplainable ache. His bitter laughter escaped him as he turned his gaze toward the line of Sylvan Concord vehicles in the distance, his mind replaying Lauren's outburst to Jake. Justin's thoughts raced, consumed by Lauren's words. Her obsession with Vasper Mondragon was no secret to him, he'd known it for a long time. Yet, hearing her bitterness now stung in a way he hadn't expected, leaving him unsteady. Suddenly, Jake appeared in front of Justin, teleporting without warning. Startling him. Their eyes met in a tense, silent exchange. Justin couldn't hear Jake's thoughts, but Jake could hear his, a frustratingly one-sided advantage. Jake's gaze softened slightly, as if he could sense the turmoil in Justin's heart. "Forget her, Justin," Jake said in a low, firm voice. "She's not worth it," Jake said softly, his voice firm. Then, without another word, Jake vanished, leaving Justin standing there alone. Justin let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Idiot," he muttered under his breath, laughing hollowly as he stared into the distance. That was all he could say about Jake. The long-awaited moment had finally come. Everyone gazed at the horizon, their eyes fixed on the south, toward Velantis Noctem, where the inner sun's radiant light would shift, rising in the south of the kingdom. This rare phenomenon would bathe Velantis Noctem in light for 9 hours, a celestial event with profound consequences for the inner world. The brilliance of the inner sun during these hours would weaken the power of Alexander Mondragon within his domain. After its luminous display, the sun would set back to its usual position, leaving an enchanted sky painted in hues that seemed almost magical. Everyone stood in awe, their faces lit with wonder, except for the 7 guardians standing stoically around Don Lorenzo. Chanty stared toward the horizon, a mix of emotions stirring within her. The sunrise resembled that of the outer world, but the atmosphere brimmed with a mysterious energy that defied explanation, much like her life and the intertwined destinies she shared with Jake. Despite herself, Chanty found her eyes drifting toward Jake. Their gazes met, and unspoken feelings shimmered in Jake's eyes, which Chanty could not ignore. Yet, as quickly as their moment began, Jake turned his focus to David, who stood serious and unyielding as he watched the horizon. Jacob, too, observed Chanty and Jake, his gaze sharp, catching every nuance of their interaction. Jake and Jacob exchanged a knowing look, one layered with tension and understanding. As the sunlight on the horizon grew more intense, the skies above Velantis Noctem began to clear, revealing the dissipation of the dark clouds that had long hung over the kingdom. Chanty marveled at the towering wall encircling Velantis Noctem, its massive height overwhelming her thoughts. What lay beyond this wall? Her mind wandered to the enigmatic kingdom of Vasper Mondragon. The wall seemed endless, but Chanty could glimpse structures that rose even higher, like the Sylvan Concord, skyscrapers so tall they appeared to pierce the heavens. The sheer scale of the inner world astonished her, an enormous mystery hidden from the people of the outer world. The revelation of such secrets to the outer world would be a grave offense, punishable by death. Her eyes widened as she noticed massive dragons soaring over Velantis Noctem, their enormous forms intimidating even from a distance. They reminded her of Vasper's dragon, and it no longer surprised her how easily he had tamed Don Lorenzo's horse. After all, a man capable of subduing a dragon could easily tame any beast. Chanty's gaze followed the dragons, awestruck, but Jake's eyes were solely on her. When her gaze lowered, their eyes met once more, locking in a fleeting yet profound connection. The moment was interrupted as the air around them shifted, tension rising like a ticking bomb ready to explode at the slightest trigger. A massive dragon, as colossal as Vasper's, emerged, its obsidian black scales gleaming in stark contrast to the soft orange hue of Dagon, Vasper's dragon. Chanty's heart pounded as she watched the enormous creature approach their position, its majestic flight both mesmerizing and terrifying. The dragon's powerful roar shattered the stillness, its echo reverberating like thunder. The guardians immediately sprang to alertness, with Jacob standing in a defensive posture, blue flames igniting in his hands. Jake cast a sharp glance at Jacob, who returned it with equal intensity. Meanwhile, David remained composed, his stance relaxed yet vigilant. "Vladimir Mondragon," David said calmly, his voice carrying weight. At his words, the flames in Jacob's hands flickered and vanished. But Jake remained on edge, moving swiftly to Chanty's side. Without a word, he wrapped an arm tightly around her waist, pulling her close in a protective embrace. Chanty was startled by Jake's sudden action, her mind racing as she looked up at him. The guardians exchanged serious glances, understanding Jake's intentions. Chanty and Jake locked eyes once more, her hands instinctively gripping his as his hold on her waist tightened. "Jake?" "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion. "Don't ask. Just stay close to me," Jake replied sternly, his voice firm as his gaze pierced hers, a mixture of warning and unspoken emotion burning in his eyes. Jake's gesture caused Chanty's heart to race as her gaze remained locked on the majestic black dragon that landed a short distance from them. The force of the wind from its mighty wings made everyone shield their faces with their hands. When the dragon finally touched down, the ground shook with a resounding thud. Jake instinctively shielded Chanty with his body, wrapping her tightly in his arms to protect her from the swirling dust. Their eyes met in the midst of the chaos, and Chanty found herself staring at Jake's face. Jake's eyes flicked down to her lips, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might kiss her. Sensing the tension, Chanty turned her head to avoid the temptation. As she did, she caught Jacob's stern gaze, as if he had been watching their every move. The dust slowly cleared, carried away by the wind, and Chanty's curiosity was drawn to the dragon. It was undeniably powerful in appearance, though slightly smaller than Vasper's dragon. Still, its presence was equally fearsome and awe-inspiring. On the dragon's back sat a man, his commanding posture unmistakable. "Chanty, that's Vladimir Mondragon," David whispered close to her ear, his voice calm but deliberate. Chanty nodded, her attention fixed on the man dismounting the dragon. Vladimir Mondragon, Vasper's paternal half-brother, had a commanding presence. His mother, Havana Mondragon, was Alexander Mondragon's second-in-command, a mistress with considerable influence in Velantis. Chanty couldn't help but feel a shiver of unease as Vladimir approached. He carried himself with the same magnetic aura as Vasper, dressed in regal all-black attire with intricate designs that exuded royalty. At his side were a sword and what appeared to be a firearm, both seamlessly integrated into his imposing image. Despite his heavy garments, it was clear Vladimir was well built, his towering height exceeding 6 feet, much like Vasper. His wolf-cut hair framed a face so stunningly handsome it seemed almost unreal. He bore a striking resemblance to Vasper, his piercing blue eyes, the sharp contours of his face, but there was something uniquely captivating about him. As Vladimir approached, a friendly grin lit up his face, aimed particularly at David, who had stepped forward to greet him. David, assuming his role as the group's leader, extended his hand, and Vladimir responded with a firm handshake. His smile only deepened, making his already striking features even more breathtaking. Chanty observed their interaction, but her attention was drawn to the conversation between them. She caught fragments about the potential outcomes of the upcoming battle with Alexander Mondragon. If Alexander remained undefeated, war was inevitable. However, if he were defeated, his allies would be forced to retreat to their respective kingdoms. This revelation added to Chanty's unease, especially as David mentioned that enemy forces were already surrounding them, hidden somewhere in the vast desert. Jake, noticing Chanty's tension, took her hand, the one bearing their wedding ring, and kissed it tenderly. Chanty froze, staring at him in surprise. His gaze was filled with love and longing, as though the rest of the world had faded away. For a moment, it was as if they were in a world of their own, oblivious to Vladimir's approach. "Jake!" David called sharply, breaking their moment. Jake turned to find Vladimir standing behind him, smiling patiently as though waiting for a proper introduction. Chanty and Jake turned to face Vladimir together, and as Chanty's eyes met Vladimir's, his smile faded. He stared at her, utterly transfixed, his eyes trailing from her head to her feet as though seeing no one else in the world but her. Chanty felt heat rush to her face under the intensity of his gaze, which left her feeling both flustered and exposed. Vladimir's slightly parted lips suggested he was at a loss for words, his expression one of pure captivation. Jake, however, was not oblivious to the meaning behind Vladimir's reaction. Nor were the guardians, who exchanged knowing glances. Vladimir's struck expression was clear. He was spellbound by Chanty's beauty. Jake's demeanor shifted instantly, his face darkening with jealousy. "Meet my wife, Vladimir," Jake said firmly, his voice sharp as a blade, breaking the spell. Vladimir blinked as if waking from a trance, his gaze snapping to Jake. Yet even then, his eyes seemed to magnetically drift back to Chanty. "Congratulations, Jake, on having a wife as beautiful as her," Vladimir replied, his smile returning, this time tinged with amusement. Chanty, maintaining her composure, let Jake handle the situation. Jake tightened his grip around Chanty's waist, pulling her closer to him in a display of ownership. Vladimir noticed the gesture and smirked knowingly, his grin widening. "Miss Chanty Lorenzo, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," Vladimir said, extending his hand toward her. His palm was open, waiting for her to place hers in it. Chanty hesitated briefly, but as a sign of respect, she offered her hand, her lips curving into a faint, polite smile. Vladimir took her hand in both of his touch firm yet oddly gentle. He held her hand longer than necessary, his fingers lingering as he gave a slight squeeze. Chanty didn't react at first, but the prolonged contact made her increasingly uncomfortable. Jake's irritation was palpable, and even the guardians were on edge, their eyes flicking between Vladimir and Jake. Vladimir, however, seemed unfazed by the tension, maintaining his relaxed demeanor. Finally, he released Chanty's hand, but not before glancing at Jake, whose displeasure was evident. Vladimir's smirk grew, his eyes alight with playful defiance. Vladimir lifted Chanty's hand toward his lips, but before it could reach his mouth, Chanty quickly pulled her hand away. Vladimir's smile faded, replaced by a look of disappointment. Yet, his eyes softened, conveying a tender understanding. "I'm sorry, Miss Chanty, if I've left a bad first impression," Vladimir said, his voice calm but laced with regret. Jake chuckled softly, the sound barely escaping his lips, though it did not go unnoticed by Vladimir. Vladimir's gaze shifted to Jake, and their eyes met in a silent, knowing exchange. David watched them both warily, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Vladimir offered Jake a sly, sarcastic smile. "Anyway, Jake, you're incredibly lucky to have Chanty Lorenzo. For the first time, I feel envious of another man because of a woman," Vladimir said, his tone laced with amusement as his sharp gaze met Jake's challenging one. Both men smiled, but the underlying tension was palpable. "Now, I understand Zalora's frustration toward Vasper because of Chanty," Vladimir added with a booming laugh, the mocking edge in his voice stoking Jake's irritation. Jake clenched his fists, visibly restraining himself from lashing out. "Now I understand why Vasper went mad over your wife, Jake. So, how are you holding up? Still okay?" Vladimir teased, a sly grin playing on his lips as he addressed Jake. Jake glared at Vladimir, his frustration building, while Chanty watched the exchange, her heart pounding at the growing tension. She glanced at David and Jacob, who were already on high alert, their expressions sharp and ready. "I'm sorry, Jake, but you already know Vasper's nature. When he wants something, he doesn't stop until he gets it," Vladimir said with a pointed look at Chanty, adding salt to the wound with a smirk. Then, with an exaggeratedly casual tone, Vladimir continued, "Oh, speaking of Vasper, Zalora asked me to deliver a message to you, Miss Chanty Lorenzo. Don't worry about Vasper. He's safe and sound, at the fire cave, or as we like to call it, their honeymoon cave." Vladimir's tone dripped with mockery, the romantic emphasis hitting like a dagger in Chanty's chest. Chanty felt the air leave her lungs, her mind struggling to deny the truth of Vladimir's words. She knew Zalora's games, but the idea still cut deep. Jake's watchful eyes never left her, noticing the flicker of pain in her expression. Chanty, however, managed to compose herself quickly, her lips curving into a calm, polite smile. "Your Highness, thank you for the news, but there's no need to trouble yourself with such messages," Chanty replied with an even tone, though the effort it took to maintain her composure didn't escape Vladimir's amused observation. For a moment, Vladimir stared at Chanty, his smile fading as his gaze lingered. Then, his composure cracked slightly, and he looked back at Jake with a serious expression. "Jake, I admire you. How did you manage to keep someone like her untouched? Vladimir's words were direct, his tone devoid of humor, as though genuinely curious. Jake's irritation boiled over. Do you want me to answer that with my fist? He growled through gritted teeth, taking a step forward. David immediately stepped in, placing a firm hand on Jake's shoulder to hold him back. Chanty, sensing the danger, clung to Jake's arm in a pleading gesture. Jake, please, let it go, she whispered, her tone gentle but urgent. Vladimir threw his head back in laughter, his voice echoing around them. He looked at Jake, his grin playful but taunting. Jake, you've changed. You used to be so cool and collected. Now, it's so easy to get under your skin, Vladimir remarked, his sharp gaze meeting Jake's blazing eyes. Before Jake could respond, Jacob stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. Vladimir, that's enough. Go back to your kingdom. David followed suit, his tone relaxed but carrying a subtle edge of warning. You know how things are now, Vladimir. These days, you can't predict how far someone's willing to go. So while your body's still intact, I suggest you leave. Don't wait until you're sent back in pieces. Vladimir's grin faltered slightly as he looked at David, sensing the seriousness in his words. The tension in the air hung heavy as the guardians watched Vladimir closely, their postures ready for action. Chanty stood silently beside Jake, feeling Vladimir's gaze linger on her one last time. His smile returned, this time softer but no less mischievous. With a playful wink at Chanty, Vladimir turned and strode away with powerful, measured steps toward his dragon. No words were exchanged as the group watched him mount his beast. Vladimir's piercing blue eyes remained locked on Chanty even as the dragon spread its wings and stirred up a storm of dust around them. Jake instinctively shielded Chanty, wrapping her in his arms to protect her from the swirling debris. When the dust finally settled, the group stood in silence, their attention shifting back to Chanty, who felt a wave of embarrassment under their watchful eyes. David let out a deep sigh, breaking the tension. My love, are you okay? Jake asked softly, his voice full of concern as he gazed at Chanty. Chanty looked up at him, forcing a faint smile. Yes, I'm fine, Jake. But deep inside, she wasn't fine. Her thoughts raced, consumed by Vladimir's words about Vasper and Zalora. What if it's true? She wondered, her heart aching at the possibility. The image of the prophecy she had seen in the Sword of Destiny flashed in her mind. Vasper was tied to that vision, and she felt an overwhelming need to find him. But how? The thought of venturing to the Dragon's Mountain to rescue Vasper loomed large in her mind, leaving her torn and restless. When David saw the opening of the invisible shield surrounding the entire city of Velantis, it was like a thin layer of electricity cloaking the metropolis. Only the citizens of Velantis and entities permitted by the kingdom could pass through. Chanty observed the wall's modern design, a stark contrast to its previous appearance. Inside, she could see the bustling vehicles flying through the city, their movement captivating her gaze. Chanty's eyes lit up with wonder as she stared, believing Sylvan Concord to be the finest city she had ever seen until now. Velantis Noctem stirred an even greater curiosity in her. Jake watched Chanty intently. If you follow the king's plan, you will become the queen of the city, he said in a deep, serious tone. Chanty looked at Jake but chose not to respond, her silence deliberate. The guardians, meanwhile, looked at her with expectation. This is the signal, David said gravely, his eyes fixed on Chanty. They're now allowing those outside the wall to enter. Chanty felt a surge of anxiety as she glanced at the imposing faces of the guardians. Chanty, don't worry. The shadow of the sword will face Alexander Mondragon. What matters is that you remain mentally and physically prepared, Marco said with a reassuring smile. Justin laughed lightly. Just don't touch Alexander, or you might find yourself bewitched. You might even mistake him for Vasper Mondragon, okay? He teased. Chanty grew even more nervous, knowing that Alexander Mondragon resembled Vasper, except for their eyes. Alexander had red eyes, while Vasper's were blue, inherited from his mother. Jake, you'll escort Chanty inside. Let the challengers go first and keep Chanty behind, David instructed. Chanty looked at David, her face filled with worry. For the first time, fear gripped her tightly. "David, what if I die today?" she asked, her voice trembling as though it might be her last words. "We won't let that happen. Don't worry. We'll be watching over you, but we can't harm Alexander. It has to be you," David replied firmly. Tears streamed down Chanty's face as she looked at him, hoping he might comfort her, but Jake pulled her close instead, embracing her tightly. The other guardians exchanged glances at Jake's bold action, some visibly annoyed. David shook his head slightly, but Jake ignored him, keeping his focus solely on Chanty. "Don't worry, I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you. I'd rather die before Alexander can hurt you," Jake said earnestly. Chanty blinked, startled, as Jake gently wiped her tears away. "Jake, stop acting possessive toward Chanty. She needs the support of all of us, not just you," Lewis interjected, extending his arms for a group hug to support Chanty. He shot Jake a challenging look. "Put your jealousy in check, Jake. Are you jealous of us too? We're not thinking anything bad about Chanty, especially not David." The guardians glared at Jake in judgment as Lewis continued. Chanty smiled weakly and stepped back from Jake's embrace. She approached Lewis, offering him a grateful smile and a quick hug. "Thank you, Lewis," she said softly. She proceeded to hug the other guardians one by one, but when she reached Jacob, Jake shoved him back, pressing against his chest. The guardians stared in shock at Jake's outburst, their surprise mirrored by Chanty, who stood frozen. Even Jacob, slightly open-mouthed, could only gape at Jake. David approached Chanty, ignoring Jake's actions. He understood why Jake wouldn't let Jacob hug Chanty. Jacob harbored feelings for her. Chanty hesitantly gave David a brief hug. "David, thank you so much. You're like a brother to me," she said warmly as they pulled apart. David smiled kindly. "Don't worry, Chanty. I won't abandon you. Your father entrusted you to me until you're married and settled. You're my responsibility," David said with compassion and care. Chanty's eyes filled with tears again as she looked at him. When she turned back to Jacob, she said, "I'm sorry, Jacob." Her voice carried a deep sense of regret. Jacob looked at her with understanding but couldn't help glancing bitterly at Jake, who stared back at him, his expression hard. "You don't have to apologize to Jacob, it was me who pushed him," Jake said, breaking the silence. Chanty looked at Jake, incredulous. Did Jake really want to create a rift between her and Jacob? Jacob chuckled bitterly, his laugh heavy with unspoken words. "I won't fight you now, Jake. Just wait until this is over, then I'll let you taste my fist," Jacob said in a low but challenging tone. Justin burst out laughing, his voice loud and filled with amusement. "That's it, Jacob." "Yes. Do you need backup? The two of us can take him," Justin said through his laughter. Jake glanced at Justin and Jacob, his face grim, his expression sharp with disdain. Chanty remained silent, avoiding the escalating exchange. Meanwhile, David appeared unaffected by the scene. He had seen Jacob and Jake bicker and fight countless times, yet they were inseparable partners in their mischief that often left David unaware of their plans. The same dynamic existed between Justin and Jake, frequent fights interspersed with camaraderie. "Jake, enough of that. Let's go. There are already many challengers entering Velantis," David said with urgency. Chanty's anxiety grew, but Jake's arm, firmly wrapped around her waist, didn't loosen. Still, Chanty's thoughts wandered to Vasper, wondering where he might be. She suppressed her desire to speak his name aloud, especially in front of Jake, who would surely react poorly. Even though she wanted to ask David, she kept silent. Jake turned to Chanty, his eyes softening, and kissed her lips passionately. The guardians immediately averted their eyes, embarrassed by Jake's uninhibited display of affection in full view of everyone. David, however, remained vigilant, scanning the nearby envoys who had seen everything. "Jake, you know it's the king's command that you're not allowed to approach or speak with Chanty, right? What do you think will happen if these envoys report this to the king?" "Don't blame me if you're punished," David said, his tone sharp as he pushed Jake back, breaking the kiss. Chanty looked away in embarrassment, glancing at David with guilt. She couldn't deny Jake's possessiveness, which stemmed from his belief that, in his mind, Chanty was still his wife, and he her husband. The king's orders meant nothing to Jake. Jake met David's stern gaze without a word, refusing to let go of Chanty's hand. He looked around at the envoys, who stood motionless like statues near the tent, their expressions unreadable. His face remained hard, his expression resolute. "Let's go," Jake said firmly, locking eyes with David. The guardians moved closer, resting a hand on Jake's shoulder as he held Chanty tightly. In an instant, they teleported, vanishing from their spot and leaving the envoys, the general, Lauren, and the prince behind. The general, who had witnessed Jake and Chanty outside the tent, turned to Lauren with a meaningful look, his thoughts racing. "As far as I know, isn't Chanty supposed to marry Vasper Mondragon?" "She isn't Jake's wife, right?" the general asked Lauren, his tone cautious. Lauren, irritated, responded sharply, "Chanty is my cousin's wife." "Jake's wife? She cannot marry Vasper Mondragon. They're moving to the outer world with Jake so they won't be disturbed anymore." Her voice was tense as she sipped her wine, visibly annoyed. Prince Denver of the Elevator Kingdom, from the same lineage as Jake and Lauren, observed Lauren closely, a smile playing on his lips. The prince had been courting Lauren, though she had no interest in him. She accompanied him solely out of obligation, fulfilling her duties during his travels. Lauren's heart belonged solely to Vasper Mondragon, there was no room for anyone else. Meanwhile, Vasper Mondragon bound and face down inside the cave, unconscious from the merciless beating his body endured from a whip. Wounds crisscrossed his torso, and the suspended necklace still hung around his neck. His upper body was bare, revealing his battered skin, while his tattered leather pants clung to him, barely intact. His head drooped low, eyes shut, lost in oblivion. Nearby, Zalora's 5 elven bodyguards stood guard, emotionless and silent, their gaze fixed on the cave entrance. The air inside the cavern was stifling, heated despite its vastness, as they were deep within the dragon's lair. However, they occupied a secluded area inaccessible to the dragons themselves. Alexander Mondragon had permitted Zalora to do whatever she pleased with Vasper until her wrath was sated and Vasper repented for his transgressions against her. Zalora, a woman who never accepted defeat when pursuing her desires, now sought to reclaim Vasper Mondragon, a man who had once been hers but was now slipping away because of Don Lorenzo, a woman whose presence threatened Zalora's future with him. From the entrance of the cave, Zalora entered, her beauty mesmerizing. She wore a seductive red dress that clung to her every curve, revealing the swell of her cleavage and emphasizing the perfect shape of her breasts. The high slit of her dress showcased her flawless legs with every step. Her radiant skin seemed to glow in the dim cave light, and her long hair was pulled into an elegant ponytail, giving her the appearance of a goddess. She had chosen this outfit deliberately, to tempt Vasper back to her side. In the past, when they were together, Vasper had never ceased to admire her beauty, showering her with endless praise and unrelenting passion. Zalora had been drunk on his words, his touch, and his desire to claim her over and over again, their moments together fiery and unending. But everything changed. Now, Vasper's gaze lacked the heat of longing it once held, he no longer looked at her with admiration. Gone were the fervent kisses and tight embraces that used to greet her. Zalora yearned for those moments again, aching for the return of Vasper's fiery touch and the intimate connection they once shared. Standing before him now, Zalora signaled her elven guards to leave. Without hesitation, they obeyed, filing out of the cave swiftly. Left alone with Vasper, she held a crystal tumbler containing water in one hand and pouring water over his head. She woke him just enough to stir him from unconsciousness. Vasper gasped, his body jerking as his eyes fluttered open. His head turned sluggishly, taking in his surroundings, while groans of pain escaped his lips. Blood trickled from the fresh lash marks across his body, the wounds still raw from the elven staff. His gaze met Zalora's, who stood before him with a stern expression. They locked eyes in a tense silence, Vasper's lips curling into a bitter, sarcastic smile despite his agony. Zalora, in contrast, smiled back, a sweet, almost tempting smile devoid of mercy. "How are you, Vasper? I hope you'll forgive my staff for going overboard with the whip. They didn't mean for you to pass out," Zalora said in a calm, relaxed tone, her voice betraying no sympathy. She was well aware of Vasper's resilience, having witnessed him endure far greater extremes in the past. What had happened to him now was but a shadow of what he had survived before. Vasper chuckled bitterly, his voice laced with defiance. You should have wielded the whip yourself, Zalora. That way, your rage might have truly been satisfied. His tone was mocking, daring her. Zalora laughed, a loud, ringing sound that echoed through the cave. She stepped closer to him, their faces now mere inches apart. Her voice dropped to a seductive whisper as she said, You haven't changed, Vasper. You're still as intoxicating as ever. Her gaze was hungry, her smile alluring. Look at you, she continued, her tone dripping with desire. Even covered in blood, sweat, and grime, with your pants in tatters, you've only grown more irresistible. It's maddening. Her fingers lifted his chin, her nails digging lightly into his skin as her touch lingered. Then, with deliberate slowness, Zalora raised the hem of her dress, wiping the blood on Vasper's lips, revealing a glimpse of her red lace underwear. She did it all while holding Vasper's gaze, her movements deliberate, calculated, to ensnare his attention completely. But Vasper seemed blind to Zalora's radiant beauty and allure in that moment. He showed no reaction to her actions, simply staring at her with a serious expression. In his mind, thoughts of Chanty and her battle with Alexander Mondragon consumed him. The possibility of Chanty and Jake being together at that very moment only deepened his frustration. He needed to escape Zalora's grasp. Zalora knelt before him, and without warning, she captured his lips in a passionate kiss. Vasper could do nothing to resist, his arms were outstretched and bound in chains, leaving him helpless on his knees. He did not part his lips, nor did he respond. Vasper. I missed you so much, Zalora murmured against his lips, her voice tinged with a deep moan. When she finally released him, her eyes searched his face, questioning, pleading. Yet, Vasper seemed unaffected, as if her kisses held no meaning for him. Vasper, am I no longer beautiful? Have I grown ugly? Zalora asked, her voice heavy with sorrow, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness, her tone revealing her wavering confidence. Even in his weakened state, Vasper forced a faint smile. No, Zalora. You're the most beautiful woman in the entire inner world, he replied. His words were truthful, Zalora was indeed the most stunning woman in their realm. But Zalora was unconvinced, her eyes fixed on Vasper, searching for sincerity. Not anymore, she said bitterly, her tone laced with pain. Chanty, she's the most beautiful in your eyes now. Her voice dropped, barely audible, but the sting of her words was sharp. Vasper's expression turned somber, his gaze softening with a trace of pity. He cared for Zalora in some way, cherishing the memories of their time together. They had been lovers for a long time, shared countless adventures, and faced trials together that no one else in the inner world could forget. They had once been renowned as neutral wanderers, unaffiliated with any kingdom, and their shared dream was to unite the fractured realms of the inner world. But everything changed when Vasper chose to live in the outer world. From that moment, he abandoned their shared dreams, and with them, Zalora. He never intended to return, nor did he think of her as she waited in vain for his homecoming. And now, with Don Lorenzo in his life, everything about him had transformed, his thoughts, his feelings, even his very essence. Vasper himself couldn't believe how deeply Chanty had altered his world. Suddenly, Zalora began to weep, her tears falling freely as she gazed at him. I never thought it would hurt this much, Vasper. It hurts, so much, Zalora said, her voice trembling, her words barely escaping her lips. She clutched her chest as if to contain the pain. It hurts here, she cried, striking her chest with her fist. It hurts. You've changed. Your lips are no longer warm, you no longer long for me. Before, the mere sight of me would send you running to me, eager to kiss and hold me. But now. Why? Zalora asked, her voice breaking as she begged for answers. Vasper looked at her, his heart aching with pity. He understood her anguish all too well. He had felt the same unbearable pain when he thought Chanty had chosen Jake over him. It was a torment so profound that only the solace of alcohol had allowed him to sleep. Zalora. I'm so sorry, Vasper said softly, his eyes locked with hers. His gaze was filled with regret and compassion, but also a deep sorrow for the woman who had once brought him joy. Yet the painful truth remained, Vasper had never truly loved Zalora. Their relationship had been born from his youthful mischief and his fleeting fascination with women, not from any genuine affection. Even during his relationship with Zalora, Vasper had been involved with numerous other women. He was careful, never allowing their paths to cross, ensuring they remained unaware of one another's existence. Only now did he begin to grasp the weight of his sins against women, as he saw Chanty's suffering caused by his past lovers who refused to let him go. Zalora looked into Vasper's eyes, her voice trembling with disbelief. Sorry? That's all? After everything that's happened, that's all you have to say to me? Sorry, she asked, as though unable to accept his words after all her pain and sacrifices. Vasper lowered his head, sweat dripping from his weary face. His body felt drained, his strength nearly gone, and all he wanted was to see Chanty. He was certain Jake was nearby, hovering around her. He glanced down at the wounds on his feet, his aching knees pressing against the jagged stone floor of the cave. The sharp rocks beneath him made his position all the more excruciating. He heard Zalora rise, but he didn't look up. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on the rough ground, unwilling to meet hers. Suddenly, a sound broke his focus, a piece of stone fell, and with it, Zalora's dress. Her red gown slipped off, and even her underwear followed, pooling at her feet. Vasper let out a bitter laugh, finding the situation absurd. Of all things, Zalora thought stripping in front of me would work? He mused, his thoughts laced with sarcasm. Despite her actions, he didn't lift his gaze, he had no interest. But Zalora, undeterred, took his chin in her hand, forcing him to meet her eyes. Their gazes locked in a silent battle, her voice soft yet full of desperation. I'm yours, Vasper. Even my soul, she said, searching his face for even the faintest trace of admiration, hoping to reignite the fire he once felt for her. Yet Vasper's eyes never strayed to her body. He stared into her eyes with a stern expression, his voice deep and commanding. The cave is sweltering, Zalora. Put your clothes back on. This isn't the right place for that. Zalora's pride shattered. His rejection cut deeper than any wound she'd ever endured. Is this how it feels to be turned away by a man? She thought bitterly. Despite giving her all, she felt like she was worth nothing in his eyes. She had always believed she was the most beautiful woman, confident in her allure. But now, standing exposed before Vasper, her beauty elicited not even the slightest reaction. Tears spilled from Zalora's eyes as she stood before him, overwhelmed by rejection and heartbreak. Desperately, she wrapped her arms tightly around him, her body trembling against his. Her bare breasts brushed against his chest as she clung to him, seeking solace in his presence, as though her grip on him was the last thread holding her identity as a woman together. Slowly, Zalora reached for her discarded dress, kneeling as she picked it up. Vasper remained still, passive to everything she did, his expression unreadable. Vasper, why are you like this? Zalora asked, her voice breaking as she cried. I'm here in front of you. I can make you happy, she pleaded, her desperation evident in every word. Vasper clenched his teeth, his eyes fixed on the chains binding his wrists. He tugged at them fiercely, frustration bubbling inside him. But without his powers restored, escape was impossible. The cold, unyielding metal mocked his helplessness, and all he could do was endure. Suddenly, in a desperate move, Zalora's hands crawled toward the zipper of Vasper's pants. Vasper panicked, but before he could react further, Zalora captured his lips in a fervent kiss. Zalora, have some respect for yourself. You're not like this, Vasper said in his deep, commanding voice, against her lips, but Zalora refused to listen, continuing her actions. She managed to pull down Vasper's pants, along with his briefs, to his knees. She eagerly held his manhood in her hands, filled with a desire for Vasper Mondragon. However, it remained limp, a clear sign that Vasper felt no reaction, no desire for what she was doing. Vasper's expression and piercing gaze challenged her. Zalora, Don't waste your time. It won't harden for you, he said coldly. Put my pants back on, he commanded through gritted teeth. Zalora's lips tightened, her tears replaced by anger. Her pride, trampled by Vasper's words, burned like fire. It was now a challenge for her to salvage even a shred of her self-esteem. She smirked bitterly, a look of defiance in her eyes. Stroking Vasper's sizable manhood with deliberate movements, she locked eyes with him. Do you think you're so righteous, Vasper Mondragon? Acting like a man who cannot be tempted by someone like me? Zalora spat, her voice filled with rage. Vasper clenched his jaw in fists, staring back at her with defiance, fighting the growing sensation caused by her actions. Both of their breaths quickened. Who are you to insult me like this, Vasper? So many men desire me, but you, this is how you treat me? She shouted, her hands continuing to stroke him, each motion fueled by anger and desperation. Vasper couldn't believe what was happening, stunned by Zalora's desperation. Slowly, he began to feel a reaction in his body, and Zalora noticed it too. She let out a laugh, but her eyes held a mix of challenge and longing as she looked at him. Her emotions, rage, yearning, and unreciprocated love, swirled together. As Vasper's body betrayed him, Zalora moved to take him in her mouth, devouring him with fervor born of desire, longing, and unrequited affection. She moaned deeply, consumed by her actions. Kneeling before him, Zalora tried to find some semblance of fulfillment in the man who didn't love her. Despite his body's response, Vasper's mind was elsewhere, on Chanty. Suddenly, Vasper spoke with authority. Zalora, let's go to the fire cave. We'll finish this there, he said abruptly, stopping Zalora mid-act. Surprised, Zalora looked into his eyes, excitement flickering in her gaze. The fire cave was their honeymoon spot in the past, a place she still frequented and cherished. Her heart raced at the thought. Without hesitation, Zalora kissed Vasper deeply, smiling as she did, while he stared at her with a serious expression. Standing up, Zalora pulled Vasper's pants back up and slipped into her red dress and underwear. As she dressed, Vasper watched her with a faint smile, which only heightened Zalora's excitement. Especially when his eyes lingered on her breasts, Zalora felt a surge of pride and joy. She called out to the elves in the cave, and they approached her cautiously, keeping their distance. Zalora turned to his elven staff and demanded the black crystal key. Without hesitation or protest, the elf handed it over. Zalora removed the necklace using the black crystal. The moment the necklace fell from Vasper's neck, his power surged back into him. He focused on healing his wounds, and as Zalora watched with excitement, she removed the lock from his chains. Instantly, Vasper stood tall, his injuries healed, though dirt and blood still marred parts of his body. His aura radiated strength and confidence, his half-naked, muscled form exuding an irresistible charm that captivated Zalora. Unable to resist, Zalora threw herself into Vasper's arms, holding him tightly. Let's go, Vasper, so we can finish what we started earlier. I missed you so much, she said, gazing up at him with longing. Vasper gently pushed her away, his smile fading. But Zalora, he said softly, almost in a whisper, this isn't for you. It's for Chanty. Zalora's smile vanished, replaced by confusion. Her brows furrowed as she stared at him in disbelief. Save yourself for your future husband, Zalora. Don't waste your time on me, Vasper said firmly. Zalora's face twisted in anger as she realized what he was saying. He had tricked her to regain his freedom. How dare you! Zalora screamed, cursing him in their language, her voice echoing through the cave. Vasper stood silently, letting her rage pour out, his expression unreadable. Then, with a soft, "I'm sorry," he vanished before her eyes, teleporting away. Left alone, Zalora stood in stunned defeat. Her mouth hung open as tears streamed down her face. She looked at the elves in the distance, their faces emotionless. Falling to her knees on the stone floor, Zalora sobbed, unable to believe what had just happened. How could Vasper avoid her? How could he ignore her allure? How could he humiliate her like this, rejecting her womanhood? I swear, Vasper, Zalora shouted, her voice breaking. I will make sure her life becomes miserable. If my life is ruined because of her, I will ruin hers too. Neither of you will be happy." Her angry cries echoed through the cave. The elves watched her silently, devoid of any reaction. After a long time, Zalora finally rose, wiping her tears. She walked quickly, her steps heavy with frustration, toward her dragon, her elven bodyguards trailing behind her.